Don't.
Hey everybody, this is Eric Keller, and in this short video I'm going to do a breakdown of the spider model that I created for the opening title sequence of Wednesday. This was a really fun project and I was very excited to be a part of it. I got to work with my friends at Filmograph on this, and very proud to say that we got an Emmy nomination for this opening title sequence, and it's actually a really great show. So it was a lot of fun to work on it, and I'm very proud of this project. So I'm on the Filmograph website. If you check out this page, you can see the credits of everybody who worked on it. Creative director Aaron Becker and executive producer Seth Kleinberg are good friends of mine. We like to drink and play pinball together. And of course, Troy Miller as well. You can also see who else worked on it, animation. James and Lee, I love working with those guys. They're so brilliant. And then you can see some stills from the sequence. So just to scroll down here real quickly to give you an idea, if you haven't seen the sequence. So I got to model this clock, which is fun, the spiral clock, very psychedelic, German expressionist kind of dream surrealism, and then it entwines with the staircase that I also got to model. So these were a lot of fun. And then I also got to animate Thing, which was great. So the model and the textures and the rig of Thing were provided by the studio. Really good rig. I don't know who did the rig, but just really fantastic. They knew what they were doing. So I got to animate Thing. I'm assuming it's a him, crawling up the stairs. And then of course onto the spider. So here's my orb weaver spider, walnut orb weaver. And what I want to talk about is why I chose this spider. And I'll show the model in just a second here. But just scroll down really quickly, you can see some of the other stuff. Then of course I have this fly model that I got to do. And Lee did the main animation, and then I kind of did touch-up animation on it and helped them out with the Venus flytrap here, which is a really fun sequence. I mean, you actually get some empathy for the fly, the poor little fly here, which I think is great. So check out the Wednesday titles if you haven't already, and also check out the show because the show is really fantastic. Let's take a look at the spider model itself. Okay, so here is my orb weaver spider in ZBrush. The turnaround on this model was pretty quick. I only had a few days to actually get the whole thing modeled and rigged. So I didn't get to go in quite the detail that I like to go into with my other models, but you can see it's mostly, the colors on here, the things that really stand out. And it's also a quick shot. We just kind of fly by and we don't even see the underside. We just see the top. So one of the things I like about working on title sequences as opposed to the main production, I've done both, but I like working on title sequences because they tend to be small teams, and the teams have a lot of creative control, and they're also kind of separated from, let's just say, the politics of the larger production in the studio. So you get a little bit more like stake in the actual project. And so Aaron actually asked me to choose the spider, which was great. So I got to really think about what would be appropriate for the title sequence. So if you take a look at, this is the actual stills from the final version, but they're pretty close to the storyboards. But the storyboards showed us going through an orb web and then passing the spider. So I knew it had to be an orb web. And what I mean by that, if you're not familiar with the term, orb web is a classic spider web that you always see in the spooky haunted house type things. It's just this giant spiraling net. They come in fairly different shapes and sizes, but that's overall kind of look. Some are really neat and some are a little bit more messy. Depends on the species of the spider and I guess whatever mood they're in. So I knew it had to be an orb weaver, which is great because, typically, if they were being lazy about it, they'd just throw in like a black widow. Now I like black widows just fine. I think they're really beautiful spiders. But black widows are not orb weavers. They create kind of more of a messy, tangled web that tends to be lower to the ground. So a black widow would not be the right spider to do for this sequence. And honestly, black widow spiders are kind of a horror movie cliche. So I didn't want to do a black widow, and I knew that the character Wednesday would appreciate more accuracy in the spider than just being lazy and doing the black widow. And so I knew it had to be an orb weaver, and then the next thing I was looking for as I was searching through images of orb weavers on various websites, I wanted something that was very Tim Burton. And this one, immediately when I saw it, I knew the walnut orb weaver was perfect, because look at it. It's got Tim Burton black and white stripes, and then even on top of that, this fantastic zigzag pattern on the top of its abdomen. I mean, that just to me screamed Tim Burton. So I had to go with it. And I think it worked really well. The one thing that I will say that is not accurate about choosing this spider, and this is really nitpicking, is this spider is found in Europe, primarily in England. The show takes place in the United States of America, so I'm guessing maybe one of the students brought it over in their steamer trunk or something. I don't know. We're going to kind of gloss over the fact that this is a British spider in an American TV show. So it's like the Hugh Laurie of spiders, I guess. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to turn this model around, only a few days to model it, texture it, and rig it. I decided to go with the male of the species because I liked kind of the club-like pedipalps on this guy. You can see. Now, of course, this doesn't have any hair on it, so when I'm modeling this, I have to imagine what the spider looks like without hair, because the hair is added later. But you can see these are the details that I created. And what I did, since I had a short time to turn this around, I took an existing spider model I had, in this case the silver REO, and this is also an orb weaver. This is made for a different project. So I took this as my starting place and then shaped it into the orb weaver spider. So I actually ended up redoing most of it because they're quite different. But this is the result with the poly paint turned off. So you can see lots of lovely details. I have the spinnerets, and I believe this is correct, but like I said, I had to do a turnaround. So if you're a walnut orb weaver enthusiast and you feel like I've got something wrong, you can let me know politely. But I think the model looks really nice. So typically what I'll do is I'll make the model, and you can see the stats. Let's see, let's close this. So the total is 31 million polygons in all the highest subdivision levels. I did split this all into various subtools, which is pretty typical, and then created UVs in ZBrush, brought it into Maya, cleaned up the UVs. Typically I do the albedo, in other words the color. I'll do that in ZBrush using poly paint, because I think the poly paint brushes are still superior to anything that I've experienced in working in like Substance or Marmoset. I just feel like I have much more control. It's faster and easier, and so the brushes in ZBrush are so advanced that it's very easy to get really cool effects, and it's very easy to create cavity masking and that kind of stuff to create this kind of speckling detail. You know, and this is all going to be covered by hair, but I still like to detail as much as possible. And I also like to kind of draw in the hairs, so that just kind of gives it a little bit more depth when you add the final hair and the shading. A little bit of a cheat, but it works. So there is the model in ZBrush. Let's take a look at the setup in Maya. Here's the model in Maya. So let's talk about my approach in this. I used Maya because I've been using Maya for 25 years. I could have used something like Blender, but I don't know Blender nearly as well. And also the other team members, a lot of them were using Maya. So it was a combination of Maya and Cinema 4D. So I didn't use Blender, but I think Blender is wonderful. Nothing against Blender. The other thing is, when we started this, I wasn't sure if we were going to be rendering this on a render farm, or if one of the other team members was going to do the rendering, or if I was going to render it locally. For the spider shots, I did end up rendering it locally, but when I started the model, I wasn't sure about that. So I used Paint Effects converted into polygons for the hair, which is a technique I've used a lot in the past. Now I also like to use Yeti on a lot of projects. Yeti is a wonderful a choice for doing fur and hair, but I didn't think that the other team members would have Yeti, so I decided to go with Paint Effects because it was simpler. And this is a moderately hairy spider, so I think Paint Effects works just fine. In terms of texturing, if we take a look at the UV layout, I went for a very simple UV layout, which is, in other words, all the parts of the model fit into the 0 to 1 space, and I used 4K textures. So normally I will use UDIMs. I like working with UDIMs a lot. UDIMs meaning that I would have different parts of the model split up into different texture spaces so that I could get much more texture resolution, but also plug in all of the textures into a single shader. That's an extremely brief explanation of UDIMs, but in this case I went with the simple, which was just 0 to 1 texture space. All the parts of the model fit into there. And then for the actual baking of the textures, I used Marmoset. I like Marmoset tool bag. If you really want to get into the weeds on how I approach modeling spiders and creating hair and shading and all that kind of stuff, I have a series on the Gnomon workshop called Modeling and Rendering a Realistic Jumping Spider. So you can check this out, and I go through everything from modeling in ZBrush all the way to texturing in Substance, and then using hair in Yeti, and this one is rendered in Redshift. So you can check that out if you like. So I want to do a brief overview of how I set up the web and the animation on the web. So if you watch the sequence, the final sequence, the animation is very stylized. It's not a realistic motion for a spider. We started out with the spider being having a bit more complex interaction. Otherwise, it was going to crawl down the web and do a turn and move around a little bit more. But at the end of the day, we ended up doing just a simple straight path down the screen. And like I said, the motion is not super realistic for a spider, but I think it's great because it is very kind of stop motion. Like the abdomen wags a little bit. It looks like a classic Tim Burton stop motion animation, even though it was done in CG. And I really kind of like that because this is not a scientific exploration of spiders. The other thing about the sequence, if you watch the whole thing, it kind of starts with the back of Wednesday's heads and ends up with her eyes. And I think that kind of implies that the entire sequence is basically like happening inside her head. It's her imagination. So in this case, I think a stylized motion was the right way to go. So my setup for the web is way more complicated than it needed to be, but it was fun to do. So typically what I do is I'll start with, I'll take a simple polygon plane, like this would be a cap of a cylinder, and I'll go in and start editing the edges of that polygon plane, that circular polygon plane that has that spiral kind of look to it. So I'll mess it up to make it look more like a spider web. And then I'll take the edges of the model of the actual plane and convert them into curves, right? So if I select an edge here and then go to modify, convert polygon edges to curves, and then I'll take those curves and I'll apply paint effect strokes to those curves, and I'll keep the history. So that means that any kind of motion I apply to that original plane, like if I want to create, like whether it's end cloth or just a simple animation using deformers, I think I used like a sine wave and soft modification, so really simple deformers. So the motion of the plane then goes to the curves, which goes to the paint effect strokes, which goes to the converted paint effect strokes that have been converted into polygons, which are shaded and then rendered, and then I hide the plane and render that. So I get this kind of nice kind of like motion to the, it's pretty subtle. So here's another early test. This is before we had the final animation, but you can see it's kind of crawling on the web, a little bit slow, and then it moves off to the side, and there it goes. And you can see there's some motion on the web. I also have these little bits of schmutz here. Again, this is paint effects, again, converted to polygons. So the paint effects curves on the actual web are converted to polygons, and then shaders applied to that. And then I have another second level of paint effect strokes that are just these little schmutzy things. And for the spider itself, this is why I say this is overly complicated. Because you can see all these locators here. Instead of just animating like a normal sane person would, where I just basically animate my joint controls in the IK and have it crawl, what I did is I set up all these locators that are basically pinned to the web itself, and then I have a series of animated constraints that move the IK handle, or the animation handle, from one locator to the next in time. And I have the actual rig, of course, is also constrained to the web in such a way so that it kind of bobs and moves. And the end result is so subtle that it's barely noticeable. And I probably could have saved myself a lot of time by just animating like a normal human, but it was fun to do. So, you know, I'm just going to go with that. But you can see how, and I think the motion is a little bit kind of robotic here. But it was kind of a fun thing to try. I think the very final version kind of simplified that quite a bit. And then if you watch the sequence, the motion of the web itself is barely noticeable because the camera moves by so quickly. For the final sequence, I did scrap that goofy system of constraints to animate the spider, and I went with a more straightforward animation of it crawling. The animation, as I mentioned before, is a bit kind of cartoony or stop motion like and less realistic, but I think it looks really cool. I should also mention that walnut orb weavers are completely harmless to humans. I guess I could have picked a more venomous spider, but that's not really that important. I think the most important thing about this spider is the stripes and the zigzags, because that's the Tim Burton thing that I was looking for. I think it looks really cool. If you haven't watched the series, I really like it. That's my opinion anyways. My favorite character is Eugene because he is an entomologist and a big fan of bees and a beekeeper. It would have been awesome, I think, if we'd seen him wandering around with a copy of E.O. Wilson's Superorganism, or any other book by E.O. Wilson would have been really great. Maybe it's in the background somewhere, but that would have been a really nice touch. For for the super nerds out there. Hey, if I had been going to Nevermore, I think I would have enjoyed it, aside from the fact that it was a very life-threatening school in some respects, and stuff kind of blows up and there's vampires. But they do get really nice classes in botany and entomology and biology, the kind of class I wish I'd taken when I was in high school. Also, had I gone to Nevermore, I definitely would have had a raging crush on Wednesday and probably would have gotten stabbed or burned as a result. Anyways, wonderful show. I'm going to do another short video where I talk about the fly that's also in the opening sequence, but I hope you enjoyed this video. A little insight into what goes into making an opening title sequence. I actually put a lot of thought and time into it, and that's why I enjoy working with Filmograph, and I love it when I get a project like this. I hope I get many more.